So Rebecca Jarvis is an Emmy Award-winning journalist. She's ABC News's chief business, technology, and economics correspondent, the host and creator of the Dropout podcast, which chronicles the rise and fall of Theranos and its leader, Elizabeth Holmes. I highly recommend it. You can download the Dropout wherever you get your podcast. I was very lucky to call Rebecca a colleague for a few years at CBS before she moved over to ABC. And I think you'll find the way she breaks all things down extremely helpful. Rebecca, I'm so glad to be talking to you.
Moshe, it's great to see you again. And it's really exciting to see what you're building here too. So congratulations.
So let's talk Theranos. And I want to get into what originally inspired you and begin with what inspired you to tell the Elizabeth Holmes story and create the podcast?
Well, it started with a pitch. I was pitched Theranos many years ago now as a solution for ABC News viewers. I was working with Diane Sawyer on a world news investigation into exploding healthcare costs. We were looking at a number of different healthcare stories. One of them was a woman who was getting blood testing, and she was going to a handful of different, she had gone to one blood testing facility. And we looked into the fact that if she had gone to a different blood testing facility, basically a block away, she would have paid a completely different amount. And none of this was transparent at the time. So after this story, I'm pitched Theranos as a solution. I start looking into it and I can't find anybody independent to tell me that it works. And at the time, that wasn't some giant red flag, but it wasn't something that we shared with ABC News viewers as a solution. From there, suddenly Elizabeth Holmes was being celebrated. She was all over the place. She was on all of these magazine covers, Forbes and Fortune and the 60 Minutes profile. And so this story that had sort of tangentially caught my eye was suddenly very much in focus in the mainstream. And I felt like there were all of these questions that had come up early on for me that still were not fully answered. And I started looking around trying to understand how I might tell the story to ABC News. And it felt pretty early on like a really good story for a podcast. I had never done a narrative podcast, but I was a big fan of Serial and Sarah Koenig's work. And so I started thinking about how would I do this? And my producer, Taylor Dunn, and I would travel, and you know what this is like, Moshe, we would get stories for Good Morning America on the West Coast at Apple or Google or Amazon or whatever the company was, Facebook. And every time we were out there, we would stop in Palo Alto or Los Angeles and meet with people who were connected to the Theranos story and interview them if they were up for an interview with our sound equipment, with our podcasting equipment. And so I was collecting the audio and sharing internally at ABC News that I was interested in doing something and a podcast. And when the charges came from the SEC and the Department of Justice, that really heightened interest because then it really felt like, okay, like this is significant. And so I was putting the podcast together. One of the key elements for people who have listened to the podcast are the deposition tapes, because I asked many times for an interview with Elizabeth Holmes and she would never commit to one. So the only time we really have her on camera answering questions directly are these SEC deposition tapes. We finally got the deposition tapes, put the podcast together, and the rest is now history.
You were describing some moments there as she rose to prominence. Take us back to when she was at her peak. She seems like she could do no wrong. She's the star. She's the next Steve Jobs. She's, I forget the description. Is it the first female entrepreneur or billionaire or first self-made?
The first self-made. Yeah, she was the youngest self-made female billionaire at one time. And all of this was, of course, on paper because of her company's valuation. Theranos at its height was valued at $9 billion. She owned half the company, so $4.5 billion. That's all gone now, along with her company, Theranos. But at the moment that she was being celebrated, this is around 2014, 2015, her Theranos technology had made it into a handful of Walgreens, primarily in Arizona. one in California. You could walk into a Theranos Wellness Center in these places inside of Walgreens and get blood tests. And it was with this promise that a few drops of blood could run hundreds of tests. What came out at the trial, which was more recently, where she was found guilty on 4 counts of criminal fraud in January, is that at the very, very best, her technology, which again, she claimed could run hundreds of tests on just a few drops of blood, at its very best could run 12 tests at any given time. And there's this moment in the deposition where she's asked directly by the SEC, how many tests can it run on a few drops of blood? And she says tens of tests. So it's just throughout that deposition, by the way, we counted how many times she obfuscates, whether it's I can't recall or I don't remember or various things. And it's over 600 times in that deposition with the SEC. And then, of course, you have the trial, which just wrapped up earlier this year. And she was on the stand for 7 days. So that was also its own fascinating thing, which we followed with our updated podcast.
And you describe her technology, but in some cases, they weren't even using their own technology, right?
Yeah. That was one of the big secrets, because they had taken these third-party machines from other pre-existing blood testing companies like Siemens, and they were either using just purely that machine, or they were adapting the machine so that they could try to take smaller samples of blood and run them through those machines. And so many people were getting inaccurate results. A number of those people were on the stand at the trial: a woman who thought she had HIV, a woman who thought she was miscarrying, a man who thought he had prostate cancer. And in his case, there were multiple Theranos tests that were run on his blood samples, and they were all coming back like his chart looks like this, because it just like wasn't clear at all what the actual result was until he got an outside test, which then showed he did not have prostate cancer.
I mean, very concerning details. I mean, this is stuff that, people were getting bad information about their health, their own health. Did it come out in the trial, and has she shown any remorse for the impact that she had and her company had?
If you want to call it remorse, the biggest thing that came out of the trial was regret in many examples, where a lot of the times at trial, defense would come back to something that the government presented in its case, and they would represent it as an error, not a fraud, not something where she knowingly made a misjudgment, but something where she made an accident, and she would say, I regret it. If I could go back, I would change it. So that's what came out of the trial. But of course, you have the 12 jurors who, despite what she said, believe that she was guilty on 4 counts. The 4 counts where she was found guilty were involving investors. So the fraud perpetrated against the wire fraud involving investors. Where they did not find her guilty were on the counts involving patient fraud. But again, this wasn't a case about malpractice. This was a case about wire fraud. So to make the argument that there was wire fraud in the case of the patients is a lot harder legal obstacle than to make the case of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud when it came to investors.
Isn't fascinating. And by the way, I mean, part of this is listening to your podcast. Part of this was watching the Hulu depiction of the podcast and trying to get at the psychology of Elizabeth Holmes. In the trial, she tried to make herself the victim. And so your sense, in having spent years now covering her and covering this whole story, was she deceiving herself? Was she being deceived? Where do you land right now when you try to get at what she knew, when she knew it, and how much control she really had over what was happening at Theranos?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the question. And I think one of the things I like about the Hulu series is that I think people walk away with a lot of different interpretations. I interviewed, after the trial, we spoke to the jurors. And the jurors are a fascinating bunch, because they're people who didn't know this story coming in, by and large. Part of the weeding out process was, have you listened to the Dropout? And if you had, you weren't a member of the jury. But But something that was fascinating, the feedback from many of them was that they believed that she believed that her technology would eventually work, but they believed that she crossed the line knowing that it wasn't working the way she claimed that it was at the points that she did in order to obtain funding that would then keep the whole thing going. And I've been thinking a lot about these stories in general and why people are drawn to them. And you'll have to forgive me. I was at an event last night, and David Blaine was performing. He's got a new show coming up on Nat Geo, and so he was there for that. But he also did a performance, and I was thinking to myself, why is it that crowds are fascinated by magic? And I think this is sort of the same thing. We all want to understand it and get inside it. And everybody knows there's something there, but no one really knows exactly how it's done. And no matter how many times you see a magic trick done, you're still interested in seeing it until you've got it fully figured out. And I think these stories are that too. You have people at the heart who are enigmatic, fascinating, maybe they're cultural icons for a moment, and everyone's trying to get inside their head. And at the same time, they're trying to see and thinking of themselves, would I fall for it? And what do I need to know so that I don't fall for it in my life?
Yeah, I mean, the other show I've been watching recently is We Crashed, on the
Yes,
rise and fall
yes,
of Adam Newman and
yeah,
WeWork, and a 40-something billion-dollar valuation, and some of the smartest bankers and investors in the world, and Jamie Dimon, et cetera, investing in this company. And then you watch the series, and you're like, wait, how did everyone fall? And and in this different respect, completely the Anna Delvey story in Inventing
yeah,
Anna.
yeah.
Um,
They're all
and
retrospective, though. I mean, in the case of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, there are differentiators in terms of who invested. So you have the early money, which is the kind of friends and family money. There are people in Silicon Valley who are cutting her checks, like Tim Draper, Larry Ellison, Don Lucas. But as it gets deeper in, what you would traditionally see with a biotech company or a really high science type company, you would see venture capital that is highly specific coming in. So you'd see the venture capitalists who have that background. And by and large, they didn't get that kind of money. What they got was funding from the Walmart family, the Waltons, funding from the DeVos family, funding from Rupert Murdoch, giant. I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in checks, but the sort of traditional vetting process that you would see didn't happen. That said, there is a sort of FOMO that exists in investing where if my neighbor's doing it and so is doing it and so bet early on Uber or this or that and always can spot something, you start to see these trends where the money is all flowing in the same direction. And it doesn't mean that there's something bad going on there. And in some cases, people are betting on the things that everyone else is betting on because at a certain point, a big enough war chest of money can actually help you get over some of the hurdles that are hard to get over as a startup. That, again, that does not guarantee success, but money is a hurdle for most companies in the early days and oftentimes continues to be. And to have that flexibility, and especially have it from big names, can help companies be successful, although it doesn't guarantee success.
What I found so interesting, and I didn't even realize this until I was listening to it. She didn't really have a science background. She
No.
dropped out of Stanford. And by the way, we know a lot of tech entrepreneurs who dropped out of college and have gone on to prominent things, but this was a very specific, to your point, a scientific thing. And so
Yeah.
it's just so interesting to me in terms of your reporting. Were people just so convinced by her genius? Did they like the storyline? What was your sense as to why she was able to rack up these very prominent board members, investors, etc., given what was happening behind the curtain?
Well, so one of the attorneys that I interviewed, Reed Cathrine, who brought a civil suit against Elizabeth Holmes on behalf of investors, he talked about affinity fraud, and he also had dealt with a suit involving Bernie Madoff. And he said that he felt that there were a lot of similarities. And when I say affinity fraud, it's this idea, again, that if someone you know bets on someone or something and you trust that person, then you're not going to do the same degree of diligence as you might if no one you knew was investing. And we see this all the time at whether it's a really high level scam like a Bernie Madoff scam or like Theranos, but we see it in the smaller sort of MLM world and that type of thing as well, where trust is built on relationships, oftentimes more than on data and verification. And not everybody believed in this. Phyllis Gardner was one of the early people that I talked to. She's a professor at Stanford in the medical department, has spent years of her career working on some of the biggest scientific questions of our time. And that was one of her early points to Elizabeth Holmes, that this idea, what you're after, first of all, she didn't see, Professor Gardner didn't see it as viable. But beyond that, it's like, if you want to do something like this, then there's going to take years and years and years of your work. I sit down the hall from Nobel laureates and people who have dedicated decades to their work. The idea that you're going to drop out of school, put together millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, and this fancy board of directors and somehow pull a rabbit out of the hat is laughable.
Yeah, my other favorite skeptic, and partially now he's my favorite because of William H. Macy's portrayal of him, is Richard Hughes. Though, yeah, though he didn't initially, his incentive was slightly different, right? It wasn't for the
he was a very different character in the story. I think, to me, some of the most interesting are Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung, who we wouldn't even be having this conversation, perhaps, if it wasn't for the two of them. Tyler Schultz, of course, put so much on line for this, his family, his relationship with his grandfather, and Erica Chung put her livelihood on the line. She was very fearful of what all of this was going to mean for her life, but she decided that it was the right thing to do. And I think that, for me, was one of the things that stood out the most at the trial, because Elizabeth's attorneys throughout the trial really made this point that she was 19 years old. They really hammered this idea home. She's 19 years old. And of course, she was 19 when she dropped out of Stanford and first started the company, but she ran the company for many years beyond that and came into the trial in her late 30s. So the government, in its final appeal, said something along the lines of, Erica Chung was in her early 20s when she did the right thing. You're trying to tell us that age is the decisive factor in knowing right from wrong. Erica Chung didn't need to be older in order to differentiate between right and wrong.
Yeah, I was so curious about the moral compass, but also just like the way Amanda Seyfried also portrayed her as almost emotionless. What have you learned about because she's sort of this larger than life character, the black clothing, the lipstick, and then of course in the series the green juice, and I was curious about the dancing, if that's a thing. But explain to me what you've learned about Elizabeth Holmes and her personality, her moral compass, her ethics, how she approached all of this, and to what extent, watching that portrayal, do we get a real glimpse at it?
Well, look, I think Liz Meriwether, the showrunner and creator of the Hulu series, and Amanda Seyfried did. I mean, they both have blown me away in this process. But of course, there are things that can't be known. We can't know exactly what was in Elizabeth or Sunny Balwani's head at a given time. And these are interpretations based on all of the evidence we have. I do think one of the fascinating pieces to this is that because of the trial, because of the claims Elizabeth Holmes made at the trial against Sunny Balwani, there were these claims of sexual assault, of aggressive behavior towards her, claims which Sunny Balwani firmly denied, but she was on the stand talking about this. And as a result of her testimony, we got a lot of text messages between the two. And it's a very intimate look at who they are, what their relationship was like. Of course, this is a relationship that began when she was just out of school, still in high school, and studying abroad on the Stanford program in Beijing. And so to see the relationship, and by the way, he's almost 20 years older than she is. So we saw that to some extent. We could imagine that to some extent, what that might be like. But then to see these text messages where they're referring to each other by pet names, she calls him Tiger, he calls her Tigress. They have this repeated prayer that they say to each other oftentimes. They talk about praying at times. And then there's also just one thing I found fascinating, and this is in the first season of The Dropout before the trial came out, but we saw a lot through the SEC depositions as well. There are very clear text messages about a breakdown inside of Walgreens, that things are not working out at Walgreens. And then you flash forward to days, weeks after these text exchanges are sent, and Elizabeth Holmes is on stage at a Forbes conference or a Fortune conference, and she's literally saying, we're going to be in every home in the next, years. The contrast between what's happening behind the scenes versus what we are being fed on main stages is completely two different universes. And I think, it certainly raises these questions about faking it till you make it. I think for me as a journalist, one of the most important lessons in all of it is obviously to follow your instincts and keep asking questions. But I think that we have to remember that when people put forth audacious goals, and that is essentially what Elizabeth Holmes did. She said she was going to change blood testing and make the world a better place. Regardless of how audacious the goal is, it does not undermine fundamentally the goal to ask critical questions about how you're going to get there. And I think that too often we find ourselves in these places where people who say that they have audacious goals are quick to say that a journalist asking critical questions doesn't want the goal, when the objective should be truth in the pursuit of it.
I very eloquently said, and that was going to get me to the final part here, which is, how has the Holmes story and what happened at Theranos impacted the investor community, VCs, and how they scrutinize these types of companies? And obviously, one concern, and I think it was alluded to in both your podcast and the show itself, was the impact, particularly on female entrepreneurs, that they already have a difficult enough time in this world, and that what her impact could be on that.
Yeah, so there has been a lot of reporting on this, and I've talked to a handful of founders, female founders, who've talked about this, that getting over that obstacle, the sort of Elizabeth Holmes lied, so now I can't trust women or whatever. One of the things I think is kind of interesting about that point is that Silicon Valley is very, very quick to say she is an outlier. She is not one of us. So I say to that, well, if she's not one of you and she's a total outlier, then why paint anybody else with that brush? Why consider her a distinguishing factor when you look at other possible entrepreneurs? So who knows? The point is, there are definitely obstacles. We know that this is the case when you look at the amount of venture funding that goes to females versus males. It's a really small portion. I hope that this will only cause investors to increase their scrutiny across the board, and that fundamentally investors will look for good ideas and bright people and passionate people and people who will work very hard. At the same time, I hope that people will continue to ask questions and push really brilliant, smart, capable people to refine and to do great work and to not cut corners, so that it is to the benefit of society as a whole when they come up with these game-changing ideas.
Is there an ask though for more transparency on the part of startups? If you're a startup these days, are you facing more questions than you once did due to this?
I don't know about that. I think that biotech is its own world because there are so many degrees, and it's a very different world. There's regulatory hurdles. There's a lot more that has to be overcome, and the people again who deal in that space are, most of them are PhDs and have these giant science backgrounds themselves. So when they look at a company like Theranos, they know exactly what they're looking for. Some of the things, for example, that the investors could have looked for with Theranos, they could have called some of the pharma companies that there were these claims that it had been vetted by 10 of the 15 largest pharma companies and given their stamp of approval, essentially. And so investors could have called and said, is this true? Is this real? And some of the investors might have, but the ones who invested by and large didn't do that. I think in the long run, it's a reminder to ask questions, to be skeptical. And again, to that point earlier, even when the goal is one we all want to see, it's still the right thing to ask the critical questions so that we get there, and we get there honestly.
And you may have just answered it, but as a journalist, how has covering this story changed you? Like I remember Holmes coming through the CBS This Morning set and everyone being like, oh my
Yeah.
God, you're doing amazing things. And she was doing the rounds and she was on the cover of the magazines. Has the media learned a lesson here? And if not the media, you as a journalist, what lessons have you learned as you continue to report on companies, startups, CEOs, that whole world?
I will speak to myself more. I think for me, it is just a reminder to keep on the stories that excite me, that keep me up at night. When I first was interested in this story, it didn't have the degree of interest that it has today. And there were a lot of other things that were going on at the time. But it's just a reminder to me to keep at these stories, the ones that keep me up at night. I also personally just loved the experience of doing it as a podcast, having this totally blank canvas and saying, let's just see. I'm going to just try and do this and see what happens. I didn't have expectations of any of the things that have come. I just really wanted to see what would happen if I tried something completely new. So I encourage other journalists who are thinking about how they want to tell a story to try new formats. And also to acknowledge that I tried a lot of new formats before this. I had another podcast that was sort of an interview style podcast. I did a lot of stuff on the World Wide Web that didn't really ever take off, but it was those years of experience of testing and experimenting that got me to a point where I could even conceive of how might I do Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes as a podcast.
And Balwani is now on trial. Can you give us a state of play? I mean, so she was convicted on 4 of 11 charges. She faces sentencing in September. He is now on trial. What does he face, and what is the state of play in that trial right now?
So it's really the same trial until they get to the defense. And at this point, they're still working their way through the government witnesses. And you're hearing a lot of the same things from the government witnesses that you heard in the Elizabeth Holmes trial. I do think, and we texted about this, I think a little bit beforehand, I think from all the legal experts I've talked to, it is much less likely Sunny Balwani will take the stand in this case than Elizabeth Holmes. He is a less sympathetic defendant. He started companies before, so he has experience. One of the key explanations the defense put forward in Elizabeth's case is that she was young and she didn't really know what she was doing, and she took the advice of a lot of other people and got it wrong. He can't make that case. And juries, they're not supposed to look at individual, they're not supposed to look at defendants based on who they are and whatever, but she was 19 years old. That's how they framed her, as this daughter and loving mom to a newborn baby. And some of the jurors in the Elizabeth Holmes case actually got dismissed on the grounds that they believed, based on their religious backgrounds, that they could not look at the case, knowing that she might go to jail as a mom. that they couldn't be unbiased with how they would look at the case. So we know that happened with her. That's much less likely to happen in his case. And what's most likely to happen in his case is that we won't hear from him. I am curious to see what argument his defense puts forward, because they were in the courtroom the whole time throughout her trial. And I interviewed, by the way, his defense attorney, which is it's in the first season of The Dropout. I interviewed his defense attorney. And back then I said, does Sunny Balwani in any way blame Elizabeth Holmes for this? No. Does he think he was duped by Elizabeth Holmes for this? No. So at that time, Sunny had not turned on Elizabeth. Of course, that is exactly what she did. And that was a major piece of her defense in her trial. And it didn't really work, but it's unlikely that, well, we'll see. We will see what his defense is.
The show makes it out to be like they were pretty much co-conspirators. Is that your impression based on your reporting?
Well, that's exactly what the government will say, because originally they were charged as co-conspirators, and it's only because of these claims of the assault and abuse at the hands of Sunny Balwani, again, which he denies, that their trials were severed.
Got it. Finally, the green juice thing, real or Hollywood thing?
I mean, that's what everybody told us. The episode, I think it's the third episode of the Hulu series. It's almost exactly what the episode was for us. Kevin Hunter, who was the consultant who was vetting Theranos on behalf of Walgreens, talked all about those meetings, the fact that he was walked to the bathroom by Sunny Balwani. They presented this flag, which supposedly was in the battlefield in Afghanistan. She had green juice. They were in the back of the sushi restaurant, and he drove his Lamborghini Veni Vidi Vici to the restaurant. I mean, everything, a lot of it does reflect our reporting in the podcast. And there was a lot of green juice.
And the dancing? Cheers. And the dancing?
The dancing, we don't have, I mean, the dancing is just a really fun addition to all of this.
So bottom line, if you're watching the Hulu series, 90% hewing to reality, 95%? I
mean, I can't put a number on it because I like to be exact when I put numbers on anything. But what I can say is that there are so many one of the things I really focused on with the podcast was this idea of scenes, taking our listener into various moments as they happened, as the sources that we interviewed recall them happening. And what was really fun for me as part of the Hulu series and working with Liz Merriweather and the team was to see those things brought to life, because I had the vision in my head based on the interviews and sometimes even based on being in the experience. I was at Theranos. I visited their headquarters a couple of times. I was kicked off the campus a handful of times by the bodyguards who stand in the front entryway. But it was very cool to see things brought to life because they were how I envisioned them. And by the way, on the music thing, music is very important in this show. I don't know if you noticed that or not, but I feel like music is so important. I always sort of have music in my head, whether it's actually playing on Spotify or I'm just thinking it. Most of the time, if I'm thinking it, it's Encanto because it's my 3-year-old daughter's favorite movie right now. But there is this moment that a handful of people recounted to us who were there, who said she would drive up to work and have like really loud music playing in her car and, would just kind of like bop around in her car. So that has a grain of the dancing to it.
It's fascinating because the WeWork storyline is similar, that he would have a song playing as he walked in the office. Though I think in the series they make it a Katy Perry song, and I looked at this. Apparently, it was a Biggie. Juicy is what Adam Newman liked to play in the office.
Yeah, music can really pump you up. I don't know. Yeah. I'm not going to knock music.
Yeah. No. We're not going to let them bring down music.
Seriously.
For us. Rebecca, I'm so happy for you.
Thanks, Moshe.
And find this fascinating. Question. What's next? Is there a storyline you're looking into? Is there a new season of The Dropout beyond Elizabeth Holmes that you're looking, or is there more to this story that you haven't quite uncovered?
Well, look, I think that when sentencing happens, it will be an interesting time in September. Her sentencing, you mentioned this, but it's in September and it comes after Sunny Balwani's trial is over. And that's, how does the judge rule on that? Does she get the same amount of time? If Sunny is convicted, will he get the same amount of time? So there's questions there. I am working on a handful of other investigations. The world is unfortunately filled with fraud. And I am always going to be curious about it and always asking questions. And wherever they lead me is what you guys will get to hear about in the future.
Well, I look forward to what's next and appreciate you spending time. And as I mentioned at the top, the Dropout podcast is available wherever you get your podcast. So check it out. And Rebecca, thank you.
Moshe, thank you so much for your interest. And again, congratulations. I'm loving everything you're building, and big, long time listener, first time caller, enjoying it so much.